On behalf of the Bellarmine College of Liberal Arts and our Dean, Robin Crabtree, I welcome you to this year's Graduate Student Symposium, Taboo Dinner Topics, Religion, Politics, and Sex. Now, for those of us who are fans of etiquette, we know that these topics tend to be taboo because in formal dining settings, we don't want to offend others at the table. And I think there's three main reasons for this. First of all, these topics tend to be very personal and intimate about a person. And so depending on the gathering, and if not everyone knows each other at an intimate level, this could be possibly embarrassing insofar as it's very personal. Second, these can be offensive because these topics are connected to deeply rooted convictions that people have, religious convictions, political affiliations, and their own private views, not just about their own sex and sexuality, but their views about others, makes these deep-rooted convictions problematic at the dinner table. And then finally, the power dynamic at the table, less in the family setting, but in business, for example, at a business dinner, you're meeting with a donor, or it's an employer and an employee. And so these kinds of conversations are very difficult, particularly when there's disagreement. And for those reasons, we say that these are taboo at the dinner table. But fortunately for us tonight, the Academy is not the dinner table. In the Academy, we examine deeply rooted convictions and we test them for truth and for validity. And so it's not just that we hold certain beliefs, but how do they hold up in the marketplace of ideas? Second, the Academy critiques forms of power that demand non-critical obedience, what Immanuel Kant calls the public use of reason. And so we gather here to exercise our public use of reason and talk about issues with each other in the spirit of discerning the truth about them. And finally, the Academy offers us a way to formulate ourselves, to give ourselves new ways of understanding ourselves, not merely our kind of personal feelings about ourselves, but to create new selves. And as a result, we can navigate the world differently than we have before. And we find new ways, as Jean-Paul Sartre reminds us, of being in the world. And so the Academy offers us a way to directly address taboo topics in ways that then lead us to greater understanding and greater senses of ourselves and the world in which we find ourselves. So let us scandalously explore these taboo subjects in the spirit of academic inquiry. Let us find ourselves tempted by the presentations you are to hear tonight, and allow yourself to give yourself over to the intellectually rich conversations that are possible when we share our ideas in public and discuss our ideas with each other and enjoy the scrumptious, delicious conversation that we can have when we bring our specialties together and realize there are more points of connection than points of dispersion. I want to congratulate today's presenters. They did a wonderful job at noon at University Hall. They're going to do another wonderful job tonight. I look forward to the presentations. And more importantly, let's all look forward to the conversation. Thank you all for being here tonight. Enjoy.
Thank you, Dr. Stone, for that introduction. Hello, all. I am Braden Ritchie, the graduate assistant of the Associate Dean of BCLA, Dr. Brad Stone, and the Senator of BCLA within GSLMU, which stands for the Graduate Students of LMU. Thank you all for coming to this year's Graduate Student Symposium for the Bellarmine College of Liberal Arts. We're glad to have you all here today, and we are also glad to give you a little sample platter of what the graduate student life and scholarship looks like here at LMU. The theme for today's event will be Taboo Dinner Topics, Religion, Politics, and Sex. And our lineup for today will consist of one speaker from each of our graduate departments here in BCLA. Without further ado, let's move on to our speakers. Speaking first, we will have Dana Tar-Savage. from our Yoga Studies department. Then second, Kayla Ray from our Theology department. Third, Jacob Longini from our English department. Fourth, Lily Spiritos from Philosophy. And fifth, Trevor Alexandra, sorry about that, from our Bioethics department. Each speaker will be given 10 minutes to present their paper, then an additional 5 minutes for their discussion among the panel speakers. Then there'll be a short 5 to 10 minute discussion period at the very end of the event. So if any audience members have any questions throughout the event, please hold them until the end. All right, well, I've used up enough time. So Dana, please take it away.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you for having me. Again, my name is Dana, and I'm here speaking on behalf of the Yoga Studies department. Imagine a dinner conversation between two guests. One, secular, spiritual but not religious, sexually active. The other, deeply religiously observant, possibly Christian, though not necessarily, and celibate by choice until marriage. Now, how can we make them both nervous during our hypothetical discussion? Let's talk about yoga. Now, that may sound extreme. After all, in describing modern transnational yoga, scholars cite universalism as a core feature. There are physical practices for all abilities and meditative techniques designed for the masses. Yoga's effects are verified by science, and it's practiced by people of all faiths. It would be inconceivable to envision being asked upon check-in at your local yoga studio if you were religious, or even more taboo, if you were sexually active. Yet, when we examine yoga's history, we see that it existed alongside religion and had distinct opinions on sexuality. Back to our dinner discussion. Is yoga religious? The secular guest practices modern postural yoga and is suspicious of religion. For her, yoga is secular. The religious guest also practices, but worries that it conflicts with her beliefs. She's heard that yoga is its own religion. To examine both these claims and yoga's modern secular universalism, we'll explore yoga's history and pre-modern religiosity, starting with Patanjali's Yoga Sutra, the influential early Common Era compendium, first highlighting what I think of as two of the sutra's overlooked ethics. So the text outlines an 8-limbed path called Ashtanga Yoga in Sanskrit, ethical restraints and observances, postures and breathing practices, sensory inwardness, concentration, meditation, and total absorption. The system's ultimate insight is the liberatory realization of the eternal self as distinct from the material world of suffering, quite different from what we think of as the goal of modern yoga. Now, that first limb, the ethical restraints, offer tenets like nonviolence and truth, as well as celibacy, brahmacharya in Sanskrit. Now, Patanjali's path of yoga leads to liberation from suffering caused by attachment, like to sex. Here, in this yoga system, sexuality is acknowledged as powerful. Celibacy allowed practitioners to redirect that power. The second limb, the ethical observances, offer precepts like contentment and self-discipline, but also devotion to a Lord, Ishvara Pranidhana. This proof of yoga's historic theism is complicated. Though the Hindu tradition considers this text as part of its corpus, scholars have noted its Buddhist and Jain influences. Further, Ishvara is not a specific Hindu deity, but a non-sectarian Lord and special soul, free from the attachments and suffering of human life. In leaving this element open to interpretation, Patanjali showcases yoga's historical fluidity. Here in this system, devotion is always to one's chosen deity, Ishtadevata. So yes, yoga was part of the Brahmanical Hindu religious culture in general, but also to specific sectarian movements within it, like Vaishnavism, as evidenced in the Yoga of Devotion of the Bhagavad Gita, and Shaivism, which credits Lord Shiva as the original yoga teacher called the Adinatha. In these contexts, devotion to God always signified a specific deity. And although these traditions counted numerous celibate ascetics, householders, meaning the non-celibate, practiced as well. So yoga advocated devotion and control of sexuality, but exactly how that was imagined varied greatly depending on the audience. Yoga was also part of the Shramanical religions, Buddhism and Jainism. While celibacy was integral for monks and nuns, neither recognizes an ultimate God. So here, yoga does not demonstrate theism. Again, this malleability reveals yoga's complex origins. It was consistently reinterpreted and repackaged, so it's difficult to attribute ownership to one single religion. So while our modern religious dinner guest may actually be right in proclaiming yoga's religiosity, its adaptability was perhaps a more pronounced feature. Medieval Hatha yoga saw the development of physical techniques that partially anticipated forms of modern postural yoga, things that some of us practice today. But practitioners then sought to preserve bindu, the nectar of immortality, said to drip from inside the skull and be lost through ejaculation. The redirection of energy through the retention of sexual fluids led to power and spiritual liberation, including through techniques like Vajroli Mudra that involved drawing liquids back inside the body instead of ejaculating. And I'll leave it there. Yet many of these same texts suggest that householders, again, the non-celibate, and even sometimes the non-religious could also practice, indicating yoga's shift to inclusivity for the non-ascetic. Ethnographic research on modern Indian renunciates, sadhus, reveals that although most practice celibacy for spiritual progress, they agree that non-renunciates may practice postural yoga for well-being. So while our modern secular guest may be surprised to learn of yoga's historical interaction with religion, Hatha yoga specifically shows yoga's capacity to be streamlined for lay audiences. So, should our religious guest release her misgivings after learning of yoga's adaptability and occasional emphasis on chastity and devotion to God, things that she holds dear? Should our secular guest, having learned how closely yoga was associated with religion and celibacy, stop practicing? These questions of yoga and religion and secularity arose in a lawsuit brought by parents against the Encinitas School District, who sued to stop yoga from being taught in public schools on the grounds of religion. Now, though the courts ultimately sided with yoga, finding the program in question not to be religious, Professor Candy Gunter Brown, who studied this case and others like it extensively, concluded that modern yoga is often both secular and religious, and advocated an opt-in model of informed consent. Studying history is the process of gaining that information so we know what we're consenting to when we practice. Divorcing yoga from its religious ties may make it more palatable for a modern audience nervous about practice something at odds with their own beliefs, or even those who eschew religion altogether. But glossing over yoga's historical context robs contemporary practitioners of the opportunity to consider questions of divinity, true spirituality, and the power of sexuality in a nuanced way within the non-sectarian and non-judgmental space of yoga. To fully understand yoga's relationship with religion and sex and spirituality and who can and should practice, we need to invite a diverse group to this dinner conversation. In fact, we need a banquet hall full of perspectives, both historical and modern, like a pre-modern celibate renunciate ascetic committed to full-time religious practice through yoga. Or a bhakti yogini, a female practitioner, using yoga as a theistic devotional tradition and studying the spiritual power of the divine feminine sexual energy. A Jain nun or a Buddhist monk whose perspectives show the impact of sexual restraint, though not devotion to a god. Or someone like French Benedictine monk Jean-Marie Deschenets, who considered yoga to be a spiritual tradition worthy of use alongside Christianity. Perhaps we'll even invite Swami Kuvalyananda, whose work was integral in bringing yoga and modern scientific research together, assisting in moving yoga towards this secular space that it occupies. So today, one need not be specifically religious or secular, celibate or sexually active to practice, but it's only through understanding yoga's historical fluidity and multiplicity around religion and sex that we may inform ourselves and realize yoga's capacity to elicit transformation and perhaps remove the taboo from our dinner conversation. Thank you all so much for listening. I believe we have a couple minutes for some questions.
Yes, thank you, Dana, for the talk. I'm gonna go ahead and send in the chat your discussion questions right there. Hopefully everyone got them. Dana, feel free to pick any one of those two that you listed, or if somebody has other questions, feel free to respond to that as well.
Excellent. Yes, thanks so much. So I was thinking as I was working on this, the first question, I'm not looking at the chat, but I assume it's just what I had written, is sort of how this intercultural or interfaith dialogue, coupled with, in this instance and in many of our subject matters instances, history, right? Studying history. How could that, right, help limit maybe like the scandal or like the sensationalism that come up when these taboo conversations arise? If any of the other speakers have thoughts on that.
Feel free, by the way, if you guys do want to speak up, raise your hand just as Jacob did, or you can type in the chat. Say something like hand raised or something like that, something intuitive, but thank you.
Jacob, please go for it.
Well, thank you, Dana. It was super interesting to hear from the yoga studies department on this kind of topic. It seems to me that when you combine this interfaith inclusive dialogue with the study of yoga throughout history, that the answers that arise are that it isn't any one definition that encompasses, modern yoga practice, but it's informed by such a large, I don't know if it's more of a melding pot or more of a cultural mosaic, if you guys are familiar with that dichotomy, but it seems that the more we combine study of history with an inclusive dialogue, the more that yoga becomes something that advocates for understanding across cultural groups and across segments of society that may think that they have nothing in common or nothing to discuss. So it got me jazzed to learn more about yoga. And I'm sure a lot of the listeners feel the same way.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you so much for that comment. I'm curious either for you or any of the other speakers tonight, perhaps outside of the confines of yoga, which is my specialty, perhaps in your own faiths or intercultural dialogues you've had with other people, perhaps someone has thoughts on that. Yeah, I see Brad's hand raised. Professor Stone?
Yes, what a marvelous presentation. And one of the things I thought of, one of the philosophers I work on a lot is Michel Foucault. And one of the things that your presentation reminds all of us is that all of our traditions have rich and complicated histories. And so one of the things that I think sometimes, particularly since, Christianity is so predominant in our society, is we forget that Christianity has a history. And I also liked the way that you allowed each moment of history to kind of speak for itself. So we don't have to push everything from the past into the present, but instead for us to actually understand the past. There we say, and Anna Harrison brings this up a lot, and she was at the noon session, this idea of letting the past speak for itself in ways that then challenge our present, instead of simply trying to make it fold into the present, this kind of presentism that sometimes affects history. And so I like the way that you allowed the history to speak, and each moment in that history to stand on its own right. And then we are stuck then with the question of, what can I now do, knowing that things are historical? And it makes these things more complicated than we often quibble with each other about.
I totally agree. Thanks so much for that comment. And it reminds me of something that was inspiring this work, a part of Dr. Zoe Sladov's book, her Sanskrit textbook that we work with in our Sanskrit translation courses in yoga studies. And it was just this comment, I don't have it memorized, but that when we're interacting with historical texts or historical ideas, that our instinct is to make it fit in with our modern understanding of things. And that when we're examining and translating and looking at history, we actually need to do it faithfully to the historical perspective as much as we can, and only then consider it in kind of dialogue with our modern perspective. So that was definitely something I was grappling with a lot. I don't know if I have more time. I have one more question, but please let me know if I should end it there.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dana, for the presentation. We are at time, so we're gonna go on to Kayla Ray from the theology department.
Thank you.
Of course.
Thank you, Braden. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you to Dr. Stone and Dr. McMillan for organizing and hosting this event. I also want to quickly thank Dr. Brett Hoover, Chair of the Graduate Theology Program, for allowing me to represent the department tonight. It's an honor to be included alongside these incredible scholars. So the title of my talk is Table Fellowship in the Eucharist, or What Early Christians Can Teach Us About Breaking Bread in the 21st Century. Clearly, I took the topic for today's symposium rather literally. In fact, when I first heard about this event, my mind immediately went to holiday dinners with my extended family in the South. Religion may or may not come up. We're all Christian, but I'm the lone Anglican among Southern Baptists, so there are a few theological differences. And when it comes to politics, let's just say we've learned to avoid stepping in that minefield for the sake of getting along. But then I started thinking about other table settings, such as first dates, where you wonder how soon you can quiz the person across from you on religion, politics, sex, and that fourth horseman of taboo dinner topics, money. I also have a variety of friends, and our conversations are usually determined by what we have in common rather than not. In short, all dinners require some amount of social navigation. But what if there's a middle ground where love and respect are able to flourish alongside hard conversations and debate? As a theologian, I'm compelled to ask if, aside from the oft-cited, sometimes practiced, love your neighbor as yourself commandment, there is anything in Scripture and early Christian practice that can help show us a better way, especially in these divisive times. To begin exploring that question, it's important to understand the role that meals played in the ancient world. From the first Passover depicted in the book of Exodus to Shabbat dinners, meals are obviously important to Judaism, but they were also significant in Greco-Roman society. Many people belonged to what we would call in English associations, which were a vital form of social belonging. Meals were so central to these associations that they were essentially banquet clubs, with members expected to pay dues and follow certain etiquette. People would spend hours eating and drinking while discussing and debating topics such as philosophy and religion. Think of the philosopher's speeches in Plato's Symposium, or imagine a rabbi and his disciples examining Torah. Rather than sitting around a table, they reclined, even as they ate and drank. The Mishnah, a 3rd century Jewish text that may reflect tradition from centuries earlier, specifically mentions reclining as a requirement in the Passover liturgy. Perhaps this is why the Gospel of John describes the disciple that Jesus loved reclining against his Lord's breast. So let's turn to Jesus. In contrast to his ascetic forerunner, John the Baptist, the Gospels portray Jesus of Nazareth as a man who enjoyed a good meal, and often with scandalous company. In Matthew 11:19, Jesus himself acknowledged that his opponents called him, quote, a glutton and a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners, end quote. What's unique here is not that Jesus attended banquets and used them as a teaching opportunity, but that in dining with outcasts and the marginalized, he broke the social boundary markers that meals symbolized in the ancient world. Following what anthropologists call commensality, so tabling as a model or map of hierarchy in a society, John Dominic Crossan calls Jesus's table practice open commensality, a quote, non-discriminating table depicting in miniature a non-discriminating society, end quote. Naturally, as a Christian, I can't talk about Jesus and tables without mentioning the Last Supper and the institution of the Eucharist, the body and blood of our Lord in the matter of bread and wine. At his final Passover celebration, Jesus played the role of the servant by washing his disciples' feet. Then, as the Gospel of Luke emphasizes, he took the bread, blessed, broke, and gave. Crossan points out that the verbs took and blessed are actions of the master, but broke and gave are actions of the servant, or of the female host who would typically prepare and serve meals. Thus, Jesus, their rabbi, played the role of the servant and the woman. This is what Jesus's open commensality, his table fellowship, looked like. This is also how the two disciples on the road to Emmaus finally realized they were in the presence of the resurrected Christ, the moment Jesus took the bread, blessed, broke, and gave. According to Bernard Cook, early Christians understood the link between ancient Jewish temple liturgies in which peace offerings were celebrated as a sacred meal between God and God's people, and the Eucharist. Furthermore, just as Jesus followed in the footsteps of great Jewish prophets, condemning empty ritual performed by those who exploit the poor and the powerless, early Christians viewed the Eucharist as not only a sacrifice or gift between Christ and his people, but also as a meal of reconciliation, of peace. It's not for nothing that Paul criticizes those Corinthians who begin to partake of the meal that precedes the Eucharist before everyone has arrived. In other words, not waiting for the poor and the enslaved, who would show up hours later and find nothing left for them. There's also Paul's letter to the Galatians, where he insists that no discrimination is allowed within the body of Christ. As N.T. Wright puts it, all full members of God's people, thus released from the power of sin and death, belong at the same table, end quote. These meals, shared by Christ-confessing Jews and Gentiles, men and women, enslaved and free persons, is when real community formation for Christians began. Ultimately, not only is the central act of Christian worship a meal, but one could argue that, in many ways, Christianity began around a table, is perhaps even best practiced around tables. But sadly, evening communal meals would all but disappear as a major Christian practice after just a few centuries. Only in the last 100 years or so have theologians and ethicists sought to retrieve this history and concept of table fellowship, to focus on the Eucharist as an ethical model instead of just debating the metaphysics of it. But is full retrieval even possible in the 21st century, and in the US for that matter? Halt Hausig points out that, similar to Hellenistic associations, houses of worship in the US are still the most prominent spaces to provide regular, non-commercialized meetings for a plurality of people. I'll post some discussion questions in a moment, but I hope that all of you here today, whether you're Christian or not, have found inspiration in Jesus's open commensality and the radical table fellowship of the early Christians. As we continue to break bread with those similar and dissimilar to us, those we agree and disagree with, may we seek to always include and empower others, and to serve and to give like Jesus. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kayla. Round of applause. All right, Kayla, I will go ahead and also do the same and post the questions for you. Right, here we are, and send. Got it. And so again, feel free to choose one of those questions. You can do the same one as you did earlier today or a different one, and speakers will respond.
Sure. Well, people are certainly welcome to respond to that first question if they like, but since my presentation was so much about Christianity, I did want to extend the invitation to anyone in the audience who belongs to another religion or culture, and ask, what are your perspectives on table fellowship and what can your traditions teach us? I see Lily.
Hello. Well, mine's going to go off the culture thing since I'm also a Christian. But just thinking about growing up in the Greek culture, we would have meals around the table, and usually my parents' generation, it would be rude if you didn't finish the food on the table. So you had to take the time to eat the food, and in taking the time to eat the food, I think it gave you an opportunity to have a longer conversation with those around you. So I think, going off of what I said earlier to you today, thinking again about like our American culture with like fast food and trying to eat as quickly as possible in our busy schedules, I think what we can learn from the modern Greeks is to take the time to sit down and like finish the food on the table and not be rushed. And then you'll probably learn something from those around you.
Yeah, that's such an excellent point. Thank you. And yeah, I appreciate the what you raised earlier today as well. Just we're always in such a hurry. So many of us, we're so busy. And even if we do sit down at a table together, it might be very quick because we have things to do or we want to go watch TV or something like that. So yeah, just really devoting that amount of time, or not really setting a time limit if you can, on having a meal with people and just allowing that conversation to flow naturally is huge. Yeah, so thank you.
This is Dr. McMillan. I'd like to bring up again something that we touched on this afternoon, but I think it's worthy of more conversation, is that there are different definitions of community and different definitions of what breaking bread might be. And, for example, here we are 3 years of practicing Zoom meetings, right? And so for some of us, and I know for my aged mother-in-law, when we were isolating from her to keep her safe, our family community did revolve around the computer screen. And in fact, I'm not sure she would have had any kind of quality of life if we weren't able to sort of beam ourselves into her living room in order to communicate and share with her. So I just think it's important to recognize that breaking bread, quote unquote, can mean a lot of things, especially in this modern age when many of us find amazingly true friendships and true, bonds with people when we're not physically present with them in the room.
Yeah, thank you so much for raising that point. Yeah, as I said earlier, I have family in the South on the East Coast, so I don't get to see them very often. So having this long distance communication is vital to us. But even just thinking about the pandemic in the last few years, and that a lot of times people, to have meals with their loved ones, they had to do it over Zoom. I don't think I mentioned this earlier, but just now as you were speaking, I started thinking about on social media, those things, I believe it's called mukbangs, but it's where people will like post a YouTube video or they'll live stream and they just are having their dinner, and they're like the viewers of their channel or Twitch stream or what have you they won't be on screen, but it's just kind of expected, oh, I'll have my dinner alongside you, across from the screen, and we'll kind of eat and chat together. So yeah, you're absolutely right that there's so many ways to break bread that's not just actually in person breaking bread.
Thank you.
I see some wonderful comments in the chat too. So
We got one more question. Got time enough just for one more question.
sure. Yeah, if people can keep chiming in on that if they want, or if there's someone here, wanting to speak from the Christian perspective. One question I had was, what are some ways we could bring radical table fellowship to our church communities, or how are you already seeing this done in your own church? Yeah, Dana.
Thanks. I'm not speaking from a Christian perspective, so I'm sort of answering both questions. I'm married to a secular Jewish person, and as secular people, we've tried to bring some spiritual traditions into our lives and our dinner tables, and one way is through having Shabbat dinner, which is sort of exactly what you've been mentioning. And one practice that we do is one of us each week will bring a question, something spiritual, something about his tradition or my tradition or yoga or just spirituality in general, and just spend the dinner time mulling over. It could be a Bible verse for a Christian community or something like that, just mulling over those questions and seeing where the dinner conversation takes you.
Yeah, that's wonderful. That's an excellent idea. Thank you, Dana.
That just reminds me, excuse me for jumping in, that sometimes I think we get a little lazy and we don't take the effort to consciously do the sharing and asking and listening. That we assume we can just plop ourselves down at the table and we're going to eat and how's your day, and like it's always good to bond over like trivial details, but sometimes we have to remind ourselves that this is an opportunity for some meaningful sharing. We need to take a deep breath and do it. And so I kind of like the idea of some rituals that involve a meal to remind us to do this kind of meaningful sharing.
Mhm. Yeah, exactly. And Ayana, I hope I'm saying your name correctly. If not, please
Hi.
correct me.
Yes, it's Ayana. I apologize. I'm traveling at the moment, so if I break up, forgive me. One, as you were talking, first of all, I'm reminded of my own upbringing and home. And soul food on Sundays after church is like a main staple within the Black home. However, it also brought to mind something that Dana mentioned earlier, in that bhakti devotion. One of the things that I found fascinating when I was going through my teacher training initially was this idea that a lot of women within Indian cultures, they were able to show their love and devotion for the divine, for their families, for their home, through that cooking, through making food and preparing the table. And that was seen as their bhakti, their devotion. And so I think even as we talk about sitting down at the table, also putting that time, care, energy, love into preparing the food. You mentioned Jesus and washing, the people's feet before they ate, and him actually serving them. Like I think there's something to that as well.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you for sharing your experience and raising all of those points. Yeah, exactly. I think it was Dr. Layla Karst earlier today kind of brought up how this can tie into ritual, and just thinking about how, it might help for all of us to, think of this as like very much a spiritual practice and kind of a ritual. And like you said, like preparing it, in the name of God, or, if you worship a God, or your spiritual practice, and yeah, looking at it that way, I think can be a great entryway.
All right, thank you again, Kayla, for the presentation.
Thank you.
Representing the theology department. And then it looks like next we have Jacob.
Thank you so much to the speakers so far and for those lovely introductions. I'm here representing the English graduate program today, and I have notoriously bad audio input on this computer, so let me know if the sound drops out. Just feel free to interrupt. So today I'm going to be talking about free speech and censorship in literature, artistic expression, book banning, and other considerations for the future of the written word. Now, on the surface, English may not seem like a discipline rife with taboo topics. Dusty tomes and decrepit libraries don't exactly scream controversy. But open any book and it becomes clear how much controversy is the foundation of literature. The Scarlet Letter, religion, politics, sex, Beloved, race, violence, sex, War and Peace, politics, class, and yes, once again, sex. Literature is filled to the brim with topics that polite society would deem unseemly. and yet society is founded on, expressed in, and assigned value by the pages of books. So with English's pedigree and all things taboo well established, I'll turn my focus to today's topic. Perhaps the most politically divisive and controversially relevant topic in literary studies right now is the discourse between free speech and censorship. At first, the answer seems easy: support artistic freedom and abolish censorship. But this is complicated by the fact that some artistic expression could be harmful to certain vulnerable groups. The news of the publishing world has been fixated recently on rewriting dated classics, giving a platform to ban books, and restructuring libraries to exclude content deemed inappropriate. Each case brings different values to the forefront, and therefore each is illuminating as to how this debate is far more complicated than it may initially seem. For some case studies, a couple of years back, Blake Bailey's biography of noted Jewish American novelist Philip Roth was mired in controversy when several women accused Bailey of sexual misconduct and leading his publisher, W.W. Norton, to halt shipments and then take the biography out of print. The book was later picked up by another publisher, but many were split over whether the consequences of condemning the author would affect his subject's legacy. Around the same time, Dr. Seuss's estate began heated arguments when they decided to pull several of his works deemed racist or otherwise offensive. Philip Nell, a children's literature scholar at Kansas State University and author of a Seuss biography, argued that it will cause people to reevaluate the legacy of Dr. Seuss, and he thinks that's a good thing. There are parts of his legacy one should honor and parts of his legacy one should not. Others felt that this content should not be removed. Miss Lewis, co-owner of Hickleby's bookstore in San Jose, said, "I think that when there's something in a book that you find offensive, what a great teaching opportunity." Other recent rewritings, revisions, and bans have involved Fleming's James Bond novels, which notably removed racist content but not misogynistic scenes, and Roald Dahl, whose estate recently rewrote a few of his bestsellers to remove, quote, language that can be damaging and perpetuate harmful stereotypes, end quote. On what can be viewed as the political flip side, other recent bans have taken effect, removing LGBTQ novels from school libraries, most recently in Florida following Ron DeSantis' so-called Don't Say Gay bill. Now, the same arguments used to justify the removal of racially offensive content are being used in these cases, protecting vulnerable populations from potentially harmful content, in this case, children from sexual content. According to the American Library Association, 5 of the 10 most challenged and banned books in the US last year were flagged because of their LGBTQ content. Now, clearly, all of these examples come from wildly different sides of the political spectrum, and yet they are all revolving around the same crucial issue. In an attempt to better delineate the various facets of this discourse, I turn to what the English academic sphere had to say about it. Liviu Melita wrote an article in Metacritic Journal for Comparative Studies and Theory, and it serves as something of a literature review on this topic. She writes, quote, "There is a persisting indecision regarding the question whether the freedom of art must be absolute or, on the contrary, if there should be limits to social permissiveness in relation to it. The current debate seems to indicate that relativism cannot be overcome. There are credible arguments on both sides. While we have an intuition that absolute immunity cannot be granted to art and literature, it is hard to argue convincingly in favor of judicial intervention to regulate this sensitive area," end quote. Now, the gut response, again from English, seems to support full artistic freedom of expression. After all, where would we be if books like To Kill a Mockingbird never made it past the censors? But as Melita identifies in her scholarship, it isn't so simple. So what are some of these credible arguments that she identifies? Well, she traces the most common accusations by which the law seeks to justify art censorship as immorality, in the case of pornography or obscenity, the encouragement of indecent behavior, or incitement to violence, hatred, and racism. Now, it's easy for English professionals to see the possible damage caused by racist, sexist, or otherwise harmful text on vulnerable populations. We believe that words have power, and we certainly don't want a book that could harm marginalized groups to have the freedom to influence politics. For a chilling example, consider Mein Kampf in interwar Germany. But on the flip side, we don't want censorship to get out of hand and leave us in a situation reminiscent of the societies in Fahrenheit 451 or George Orwell's 1984. Additionally, there's the question of if ideas, especially classified as fiction, fall under the same jurisdiction as physical action. Furthermore, censorship can have unintended consequences that render it futile, such as the notoriety effect in which banned books see increases in sales. However, this notoriety effect usually only affects works that already have a platform. If the ban is at the legislative, local, or educational level, the notoriety effect can be removed. For example, LGBTQ books that are removed in children's libraries don't tend to have the unintended popularization. Instead, they just have an audience that loses exposure and access. Regardless, it's hard to disagree with the reasons on either side outright. We want to defend artistic freedom, but we want to limit content that could harm minority groups. You might support censorship in the form of removing anti-Semitic or racist language from a modern novel, but you might also rail against censorship when it comes to banning books simply for LGBTQ content. Melita concludes, quote, "The bibliography of the problem indicates that the theme of censorship in art is the reason for permanent controversy. Although both positions taken in the dispute are comprehensible and compelling from the perspective of the ideology assumed by each, all of these interpretations are undermined by various problems." Now, we can all see the merits of a moderated approach to both free expression and censorship, and we can all imagine nightmare scenarios where one approach is taken to the extreme. For this reason, I'm not here today to tell you which option is correct. Rather, I'm here in the spirit of taboo dinner conversations and as a representative of the English graduate program to urge you to live in this controversy. The important thing is that this can't be a conversational non-starter. We need to be able to discuss the implications of free speech and censorship, and we need to have the difficult conversations, or this delicate issue could swing too far one way, and we could end up with dire consequences. For the sake of democracy, argument, and the future of the written word, we must always be examining how we decide to regulate artistic expression and what the intended and unintended consequences of this regulation may be. We must always be, in other words, ready to scream across the dinner table and to be screamed at in return. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Jacob, for that fantastic presentation. And I've just sent in your discussion questions, so feel free to take apart any one of them, and floor is yours.
So I actually had something that kind of came up in the first presentation with Dr. Stone's comments about how much authority we give historical texts and historical moments, and whether we want to fold those into the present or try and give them their own historical space. So I'll ask a question that's not actually there and say, do we give a different authority to historical texts when it comes to taboo topics? Do they sort of triumph over our modern taboos because they come from like an earlier time? Or does the taboo sort of lose some of its power because we dismiss it as something that comes from a time where such topics weren't taboo? If anybody wants to talk about that or any of the questions, feel free. Go ahead, Dana.
Well, thank you so much. That was super interesting. And as you probably can guess from my comments, I think that in studying historical texts and examining them, we should be looking to what they actually said, for better and for worse, if it comes to that. In my field, we see a lot of interesting and problematic things coming up in the texts. And I think it really is that dinner conversation or that academic conversation around why that's problematic today that actually is enriching to see what was going on in these historical texts and how we can talk about them today. So I think that's a really great point that maybe could help with the discussion about what should be censored and what shouldn't.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was your position that prompted that question for sure. So I'm glad to hear a little bit more from you. I've got some other questions in there related to, are there any lines in the sand that you feel like you can draw as far as something that should always be limited, something that should never be limited? Perhaps that's another conversation starter if anybody wants to go on that.
One thing that Lily, just 1 second, is the one thing I wanted to say this as a scholar and of with gray hair, that I get very nervous when we erase historical records, because why erase something when instead from this this vantage point of experience and added education, we can add to historical records and buttress the knowledge that we see there. So by censoring or negating or rewriting or in somehow changing the original text, we lose the original work, which represents the state of mind at the time for the person who was putting those words to paper. What we can do now is add the gained knowledge since that point to reframe or add context to the historical works. So to me, it's just completely mind-boggling that one would think it is okay or even appropriate to erase a historical document instead of the clearly superior strategy of adding knowledge to this thing that already exists.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think that's why I maybe see a bit of a dichotomy between how we treat historical texts or texts that have already been established to have cultural significance versus things that are being produced today, and why those are often different conversations. Lily, do you want to go ahead?
I think I'm just adding to Dr. McMillan's point now because I agree with what she said, but basically in thinking about possible texts that might be racist or misogynistic or something like that, and we feel like we should either ban them or do something about them, it does seem scary because you could argue that like Plato or the Bible or other important texts that I think people should read are misogynistic, and that is it's seeming to erase a certain part of history. And I agree with everything she said. I think we should just have these types of conversations and be able to discern that this aspect of certain texts, there's something wrong about them, and then just continue forward with that discernment so that we can learn from difficult texts that have already been written. And also, I just think it's hard to draw the line. Like if you draw a line, I think you're getting into that 1984 culture, and we don't want to do that. So, yeah.
And I have a possible follow-up. Braden, how are we on time? Should we move along or?
Yeah, you can respond and then we'll move along right after that.
Okay, well then I'll just close by saying thank you all for your comments. I found it really engaging. I'd love to rewrite my comments given the insights that came to me today. So thank you all for participating in this dialogue.
Thank you, Jacob, so much. Yeah, it's really nice to, it's what this event is for, to be very interactive for us to discuss and inquire about these different things, these different topics, and the perspectives from which we see them. So it's good to see that all of these little interactions are proving fruitful. Next, we have Lily Spiritos from our philosophy department. And Lily, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I am having a bit of trouble with my screen, so in the discussion part, just tell me if somebody's raising their hand and I'll respond. But here we go. So I'm going to start with a thought experiment. That way, if you haven't read certain philosophers, this thought experiment can allow you to participate in this conversation. So here we go. Rose, a second-year student at LMU, met a young fellow named John in biology class. They grew close and soon enough began dating. John came from a fairly liberal, non-religious family in the San Fernando Valley, while Rose came from a more conservative, devout Catholic family in the Bay Area. One weekend, Rose decided to invite John to her family's home for dinner. They headed north on the 5, stopped at Harris Ranch for lunch, and listened to the latest Joe Rogan podcast episode. As they walked through the door, John was excited and nervous to meet the two people who raised the girl that he felt he already loved. At first, things went smoothly. Rose's mother asked John about himself, and he discussed being a finance major, the president of Sigma Chi something or other fraternity, and how he adored his rescue dog Snickers. Rose's mother then asked, "If you intend to marry my daughter, would you convert to Catholicism?" Dumbfounded, John began to stutter. "She told me you aren't very religious. Why is that? Do you believe in God at all?" Rose stopped her mother, exclaiming, "This is profoundly inappropriate. then embarrassed on behalf of her mother, rushed John out the door. Later, John asked, "Why do you believe in God?" To which Rose replied, "Well, I just know. Through different signs and personal experiences, I believe. I guess I was brought up Catholic as well." It's silent for a moment. "Why don't you?" I never really thought of it much until now, but I guess I didn't really grow up in that kind of environment. My parents never brought me to church. Even though this is a made-up story, I don't think it sounds too surprising that someone who is baptized in the Catholic Church and attended Catholic school identifies as a Catholic, just as it may not be shocking that someone who attended a public high school and had never attended any type of church on Sunday identifies as agnostic. Of course, something may occur in either of these hypothetical characters' lives that challenges their original beliefs. Rose's brother dies and she begins questioning her faith. John goes to church with Rose and the priest's sermon is so moving he sets up bi-weekly meetings with him, ultimately leading him to convert. But it may be the case that many of us in this Zoom room hold beliefs that we have always held, beliefs that are such a complete part of our identity that we latch onto them like habits. Aristotle says moral virtue is the outcome of habit. And while I think there is much to unpack from this idea, I want to argue that we should question our habits, any habits, even the ones we are certain are good and virtuous. In his book, Anatheism, Richard Carney argues one should, at least temporarily, leave behind their faith or non-faith. During their time of departure, one can welcome the other, meaning anyone different from them, by expanding their hermeneutic circle. The hermeneutic circle is a reference to the fact that our existing perspective, social, religious, linguistic, etc., shapes the way we view the world and therefore what we see in the world and what it means to us. By exposing ourselves to the other, we can be introduced to a different perspective through attending to their culture, religion, political views, way of speaking, and more. I think if we are humble enough, silent enough, and actively listen to the other charitably, then we may even be able to see the world from a different perspective. Welcoming the other can occur in various ways, and the other can itself include other human beings, other animals, or even that which seems completely other, like a tree or water. For this discussion, though, let's focus on other human beings, since we can communicate with another human across the dinner table. Practically speaking, in the context of religion, welcoming the other would mean that the atheist converses with the theist without defending the opposite perspective. Rather, they really try to understand alternative beliefs. They attend church, read dogmatic texts, and observe. On the other hand, the more religious person might take a break from attending church, or at least the church she grew up at, exposing herself to alternative beliefs and practices. Or they can read Nietzsche to truly challenge their beliefs. Regarding politics, the elder family member who worships CNN decides to switch channels to Fox, or strays away from cable altogether to read various independent news sources, and then calls their younger nephew to have a political discussion with the intention to learn something from them. The same idea follows with the conversation of sex. Some treat sex more casually, while others save themselves for marriage. If we get to know another person with the opposite perspective than our own, then we can understand them better. And even if we do not ultimately switch sides, through understanding the other more, we can empathize with them. At this point, we can choose to love the other, or we can choose to reject the other. Understanding does not necessarily mean tolerating. For instance, we might not choose to tolerate the racist other or the sexist other. More optimistically, if understanding the other led to loving the other more often, how different would the world look? How would it look if we chose to love those who look differently, act differently, speak differently, and believe differently than us? I do not believe this would solve all of our problems, but I do believe our problems would become a lot easier to solve as we would understand each other much more. Most importantly, it is all right to come back to your original beliefs. But as my professor said just last week, anything we take as certain deserves scrutiny. At the bare minimum, we should question our habitual beliefs in hopes of getting closer to the truth. Thank you.
Thank you, Lily, for the presentation. I've just sent in the discussion questions corresponding to it, and feel free to take the floor.
Okay, so my first question is, can you think of more examples of practical ways we can expose ourselves to the other, meaning another person different than you, that can lead to us understanding people different than ourselves better. Kind of repeated myself there. But any other practical examples where we can welcome the other? Again, sorry if I don't see your hand. I only see Braden right now.
I threw this in the chat for a different question, but for those of us who weren't at the earlier session, I wanted to share that Dr. Lauren Sinclair, the assistant dean, talked about in the Jewish tradition, there's a mitzvah that encourages the individual to invite the other to share a meal. And in the teaching, it's like quite literal, but in the interpretive tradition, it becomes inviting others to join us at blank. And she talked about how is it that we invite others who don't have a place to go eat or talk or be in community with others. How do we invite them into the activities we're doing? And it sparked a conversation of people kind of chiming in of like, how do we invite people to the post-church coffee hour? How do we invite people to the happy hour with fellow professors where we like talk philosophy and drink tequila, like whatever the event may be. I think one way that we can expose others to diverse perspectives is just inviting them to come do something with us in which we'll have a conversation. So I thought that was really cool that from the Jewish perspective, Dr. Sinclair could like bring up a viable option for answering your question.
That is a great point, and thank you for reminding us of it. But yeah, I think that's a very easy way to, I at least personally, confessing my own personal life, but I tend to hang out with a lot of the same people and eat dinner with a lot of the same people. So if I invited either more distant friends or like somebody I meet at LMU, another person outside of my circle to dinner, then that's an example of a way to easily expose yourself to somebody that you might be not used to with their own beliefs. So yes. Dana?
Thanks. Yes. I'm just thinking of another facet of our modern society that we find ourselves in that kind of additionally complicates this idea that you're speaking about. And that's the algorithm on social media, giving us confirmation bias that everyone's talking about this. Someone might say, and I'm like, well, I've not heard anyone talking about this because my algorithm doesn't show me that. So I think that's an important thing to remind ourselves of, is that also in our social media circles, we're being fed things based on what we want to see and based on people we want to follow. And that's not necessarily a reflection of reality. So.
Yes. And I think that's a very difficult issue to deal with because we can't, at least I don't know how to change our algorithm easily. So at least in non-virtual life, I think we can make easier moves to welcome the other, but that's a great point. Like exactly the news that we expose ourselves to and the media, any media that we expose ourselves to, is it just feeding back our own language and thoughts and confirming our biases? That seems legitimate and a huge issue as we just progress more and more into using these types of different media. So. My second question, in case, I don't know if I have time, but I was just thinking about too how language can easily influence the way we think about things. And just right now I'm in ancient Greek, but in learning a different language, I think it can alter the way we think about something. And even if it's within our native tongue, if it's within English, let's say, just talking to, again, people outside of your immediate circle about things, you can learn something from the way they talk about something. So yeah, I thought that was interesting.
I think related to that, Lily, is I would point out that we each have a responsibility to consciously step outside of our normal parameters of engagement, but also of language, Like you won't learn how the vocabulary of somebody else's interests unless you consciously take the time to learn it. And
Yes.
I go back to, because I'm only making comments about myself, sort of the lazy nature of human nature. I have to remind myself to take that effort. And I would say without fail, the reward is so just overwhelmingly positive when I remind myself to take responsibility for the initiative.
Thank you. Well, if there's no more questions or comments, Brayden, then I think, or if I can move on.
Yeah. Well, thank you again, Lily, for the presentation. Let me see really quick. Yeah, they were very insightful, and I personally loved Kearney's, I believe is how you say his name, anatheism. So I'm so glad to see that you brought it up into the discussion, because I think the concept of anatheism really tempers our judgment and keeps us from arrogance, especially when we're having these discussions about taboo topics. So really glad to see you bring that up. Next, we have Alexandra Martinez, paper entitled Gender, Equality, and Sex. So the floor is yours, Alexandra.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming today. My name is Alexandra, and I'm presenting on behalf of the Bioethics Institute. Okay. The sexualization, objectification, and scrutiny faced by women in our patriarchal society have a magnitude of negative effects on our conceptualization of women's sexuality. Women are sexually objectified and are often made to feel socially unsafe. They share sentiments of discomfort and dissatisfaction with their own bodies due to beauty standards perpetuated by society. These negative sentiments towards sex and sexuality are particularly prominent among heterosexual women. Many heterosexual women find their male sex partners to be dismissive of their pleasure. As a result, we find ourselves in a society of women who lack a sense of sexual entitlement. In a phenomenon known as the orgasm gap, heterosexual women report experiencing orgasms at a substantially lower rate than their male counterparts. Approximately 65% of heterosexual women report achieving orgasm always or almost always during their encounters with men. Meanwhile, approximately 95% of heterosexual men report achieving orgasm always or almost always in their encounters with women. In a series of studies conducted by Armstrong et al., she analyzes sexual inequalities faced by women throughout the lifetime. In one study focused on college-age women, orgasms are found to be more common within relationships than in hookups. Men in relationships express more investment in their female partner's pleasure, while men participating in hookups express little to no regard for the pleasure of their female partner. In a separate study by Armstrong et al. Regarding the provision of cunnilingus, it was found that women participating in hookups must be assertive to get cunnilingus. In contrast, men's interest in giving cunnilingus in relationships sometimes overrides the women's lack of interest in receiving it. Moreover, in the 1990 Kinsey Institute report on sex, after interviewing 2,480 married and divorced women, it was found that approximately 10% of women would never experience orgasm in their life. As a result of the data presented, women grow to place less and less importance on their own desires and orgasm achievement for their sexual satisfaction. Women are desiring sex less and less. In a series of interviews conducted by author Catherine Rowland, she shares a quote from one woman stating, "I might not even want to have sex, but if he wants sex and I give it to him, then yes, I was a good wife today." With continuous reinforcement of the subordination of female pleasure throughout the lifetime, women experience a non-hormone related decrease in libido. Many even go to the extent of sharing the sentiment that sex is chore-like. What is the moral significance of this? In a paper titled "The Moral Significance of Female Orgasm," Mary Pallauer notes an important distinction within the phenomenon of sexual inequality. Pallauer states, "Women cannot take orgasms for granted. Men apparently do so, at least for most of their lifespan. Female orgasm does not come naturally. We have to learn it. Many layers of interpretation swath the experience of orgasm like veils or shawls, thus pressing us towards the second layer of problems. Pallauer identifies the second layer of problems to be interpretive, expressing that many women can't talk about sexuality at all. She cites social pressures as creating internal inhibitions and self-doubts. In contrast, a small other group of women express openness towards the topic of orgasm and sexuality. These contrasting responses to the topic reveal the vastly different attitudes towards and understandings of the female orgasm. Pallauer identifies 6 aspects to clarify the experience of orgasm: being here and now, varieties of sensations, ecstasy, vulnerability, power, and nothing above can be taken for granted. In providing this criteria inspired by her own experience, Pallauer describes her sexual relationship with her husband, showcasing many of the internal issues regarding sexual entitlement mentioned above. She states, "My pleasure was important to him. This was hard to accept. He was willing to persist in trying to bring my release ecstasy, and he reveled in it. This shook me very deeply. It was so unexpected. My surprise about this says more about me than it does about him. I did not expect to be loved. I did not expect him to have the capability to put me before himself. I expected only to be secondary." She expresses experiencing this with her husband as an instance of vulnerability to her, reaching out to meet her vulnerability to him. In expressing female sexuality, are we teaching women that they are not deserving of love? Are we implying that the female orgasm is a good that only can be afforded to us by men? Are we witnessing the erasure of vulnerability from intimate relationships? These notions are clearly extremely detrimental. In response, Pallauer calls for a multiplicity in feminist sexual ethics that can at least match the multiplicity of women's sexual experiences, identifying the concepts of trust, openness, and vulnerability to be key in this discussion. I support such an approach. Much of the intimacy of sex has been extracted from the act, leaving it to be a transactional, mechanic ritual where heterosexual women tend to receive the short end of the stick. Though this view cannot be more flawed. Women are equal sex partners. They, like men, are endowed with dignity. This ideology takes roots within Kantian ethics. Immanuel Kant's second formulation of the categorical imperative holds that we must treat humanity as ends, never merely as a means. Many women are essentially expressing the sentiment of themselves and their bodies being treated as merely means. Objectification, lack of care, and misuse are direct moral violations to this dignity which is inherent to all of us. The female orgasm is not a gift from men. The orgasm is a gift from one's own body. Women must be encouraged to take power within their own sexuality to advocate for their pleasure, whether that be in encounters with men, women, or alone. We must cultivate an environment of care where women believe that they are worthy of love and pleasure. Women have the right to feel sexual entitlement. Lastly, this should not be a taboo topic. Sex is as natural to us as eating and sleeping, and it ought to be treated that way for men and women alike.
Thank you, Alexandra. That was a interesting and very insightful presentation, one I've been personally interested in the past, but had been unaware of before having read your paper. I'll go ahead and post your discussion questions, and you feel free to pick from whichever one you like.
Great, thank you. Okay, sorry. Let's start, I guess, with the first one then. How do we suggest going about encouraging women to take power within their sexuality? So I'm opening this question to anyone in the audience. I have my own thoughts. So, okay, I see Mariah raised her hand.
Hello, hi. I think one approach would be education, just to like erase stigma, and then also kind of embedded into our society as a cultural norm. I like the statements that you had said, like, why should women not, feel this sensation? Why do men feel the need and not be able to reciprocate that? So I feel like a lot of it just has to do with it being a social norm, and then also education just to like reduce stigma.
Thank you so much for that. I also agree. I mentioned in my own separate thoughts that definitely it should be a part of sexual education. Of course, the degree of how in-depth this conversation gets may, it's going to vary depending on like age ranges and, sexual activity. But I definitely think this starts with education. So thank you for that. I also see a hand from Ayana.
Hi, yes, thank you. Thank you so much for sharing this topic. Anyway, thank you. This is definitely something that needs to be talked about. I think it also goes back to what Lily said earlier. It's like, who are we in conversation and community with in order to have these discussions? One thing I will bring up, I don't know how much time you have on LMU's campus, but if you have a chance to take Tracy T. Meyer's Feminist Theology, by all means, that is the absolute best class in a sense where you are kind of deconstructing and almost unlearning a lot of the society or the societal norms that have been placed upon us, right? So when you look at the early happenings of Christianity and how the theologians of that time really how they crafted the image of women, this pitting of Eve against Mary, the Virgin Mary. So we are supposed to be seen as virgin mothers, but how do you have children if you are a virgin? But so there is this idea that sex is completely wrong and unnatural for women to have, for women to experience. And I think that could be a place where we start to unpack some of this, what society has said to us. And I think the last thing I'll leave you with is Audre Lorde and the power of the erotic, and how this act of orgasm, this sexual energy, this Shakti energy Dana will know about, like, that is power for us. And so we definitely have to have conversations about it and really bring that back into the forefront of our own lives. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Ayana. I really appreciate the historical and theologic perspective that you just provided. Thank you so much. I also see a hand from Kayla.
Yeah, so first, I have to second Ayana with Tracy T. Meyer's Feminist Theology course. I'm always promoting that class to other people, like, you have to take it. But yeah, also I was thinking about this too from, a Christian perspective, and, there's so much that could be said about the damages of purity culture, which we, don't have time for tonight. That's a whole symposium in and of itself. But the unequal expectations and beliefs kind of placed on women as opposed to young Christian men, and then how there are so many stories of then after they get married that women report feeling unsatisfied, or their expectations, it's not what they thought it was going to be, and things like that. But I was just thinking about the verse, and I think it's 1 Corinthians, where Paul is saying that just as the wife's body belongs to the husband's body belongs to the wife, and how pretty radical it was for someone to say that in the first century. And I think that's something that's not talked about nearly enough in Christianity. And so you're still, from that Christian perspective of like giving yourself to your spouse, but you owe it to your spouse, you owe it to your wife to give her, the love and pleasure that she needs. So that was just something that came to my mind.
Thank you so much, Kayla. Do we have one more do you have a question? Do we have time for one more question, Braden?
Yeah, for sure. We got enough
Okay.
time. We've got 2 or 3 minutes. So.
Okay, great. I'm gonna jump to the third question. So what does this gender inequality in sex do to our conceptualization of love? If anyone has any thoughts on that. I can offer my own thoughts, and then if anyone, oh, actually, sorry, 2 people raise their hand. I'll save my thoughts. I can't see who raised their hand. It just said 2, so.
I raised my hand.
Okay,
Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
I'm gonna try to. I have no idea if I even believe what I'm saying is true, but I'm gonna try to answer your question. So I'm thinking like this gender inequality in sex might make us conceptualize love as like a woman pleasuring a man. That's how she can show him she loves him. Where if a man doesn't think that's as important to a woman, he might try to show that in different ways. And I think just like a conversation between a couple, any couple, is important just so that they know how they receive love. So if a woman does feel more loved through the act of sex, I think it's important that this isn't a taboo conversation and she vocalizes that. And if it's not too, if it's through other ways, I think it's important for people in a relationship to vocalize that to each other. So I don't know if that got to your question, but that's my thought.
No, I definitely agree. The communication aspect between sex partners is very important. A lot of people may have different conceptualizations of love that are independent from sex. So thank you for that point. And then Jacob.
Yeah, excellent talk. I think it's really galvanized a lot of our discussion so far. Like everybody's jumping in. I think your question reminds me of something you said about like education maybe being the solution for some of these sort of negative entrenched beliefs that women and men have both sort of adopted. And I think that one place to look at how we sort of change these perspectives is, from my own perspective as English professional, is how we portray acts of love in artistic expression, whether it's books or films or whatever it may be. Because I think if we're seeing, if we're reading books and watching movies that show acts of love that are not drawn along gendered or sexualized lines, like the male serving a certain role in most, cultural productions and women serving a different role. If that's complicated and that spectrum is really like shown in all the diversities that it can include, perhaps we'll have less people growing up with these entrenched visions of like, this is what it means to be a man who loves, and this is what it means to be a woman who loves. The more examples people see growing up that are not along those lines, the better, I think.
Thank you for that. I definitely agree.
All right. Time is up, but thank you so much, Alexandra, again for that presentation on the bioethical perspective of these taboo topics on sex in particular. With that, we now can move into our discussion period. We got about 10 minutes. So if anybody has any questions they've been cooking up while these speakers have been going off, then just go ahead and voice them, raise your hand, or type it out in the chat box, and we'll try to hit all of them. All right. Yes, Michael.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for all your amazing presentations. This last topic by you, Alexandra, which was super interesting, as everybody else mentioned, and Jacob's remark reminds me of, and I can't be quoted on this because I know it kind of vaguely, of a certain American-led church code that was imposed upon Hollywood back in the 50s, which I'm sure you guys would know the name of it, but like it said like exactly codified like how a man is allowed to touch a woman, and like they can't be like he can't be in bed with her, so he has to lean over weirdly with one foot on the floor. And that kind of explains like a lot of the scenes that we see like in the Hitchcock era where you know, that kind of thing was not allowed because of, you know, whatever chastity, whatever was their point. And it led to a subsequent subculture of X-rated movie, which showed those female and male interactions as they're like, you know, the taboo thing, only to counteract what the church was saying, and that they were X-rated because they were not allowed, and that led to the double X-rated, which was a little bit more rough, and then triple X as we know it today as porno. And you just reminded me of that. I remember my mind was blown when I learned that that's why it's called triple X movies. It has to do with that thing that was in the 50s, something about the church. There's like a code that was imposed on Hollywood. So I just wanted to bring that into the mix and share it. Thanks.
Thank you. I did not know that. So thank you so much for expanding my own knowledge and everyone else's.
I think it's interesting to, based partly on what Michael said, for us to consider how much the film industry or how much media tends to dictate what the society thinks is appropriate or acceptable or what is out of bounds. And that's kind of, I think, related to Jacob's presentation is who gets to decide who's the gatekeeper, right? Who's the we, right? That's what they said this afternoon. Who's the we that gets to decide what the rules are and how they're going to be followed and who's accountable for keeping us true to them? I don't know that answer. Although today I think somebody said, we who are actually here listening to the talks are the we who get to decide. And everybody seemed to like that idea pretty much. But seriously though, my point is that as Michael brings up, you know, there are sort of external forces that are educating the general public about what's acceptable and what's not. And that's the responsibility we have to take, is to shape those into actually ethical and healthy parameters.
Ayana?
I think that's a great point, Professor Gigi, that you bring up, especially right now as we're talking about, you know, African-American AP history being taught in schools, and this idea of like critical race theory and kind of almost this reimagining of history in some places, wanting to kind of gloss over some things that were happening because, you know, it might be too hard for people to deal with. And it's like, well, we have to have those hard conversations. I also look at this, I guess, the situation with the Roald Dahl books and them putting out, I think they've decided to have both copies, right? The edited version and then the non-edited, and people can decide for themselves. But I think this might have also been said earlier, like having literature, having texts, having just things that we have from the past, right? It allows us to have a conversation about where we're going and why that might be problematic, instead of trying to erase it as if it didn't happen. Because I think that's a disservice to people, because if you don't know your history, then you have the tendency to repeat it. And so, yeah, that's my thought. But thank you to all the speakers today. Your conversations and your papers were riveting, and I appreciate it.
I think you bring up an interesting angle to this debate about like what we choose to limit and what we don't want, younger generations to learn. It's very different to argue for removing racist content from like a literary classic that could be a way of teaching a current generation about the sentiments at the time and analyzing like why that content is showing up. It's different when we're looking at like children's books that are still going to be used to read like bedtime stories to kids. Like I think the influence of potentially harmful content in a children's story is different than potentially harmful content in a classroom setting. And I think if anything, like these kind of considerations just keep adding depth to this topic. And I keep feeling like there's more and more minute variations of the larger conversation that I first brought to you all. Is we're just adding like, oh, but what about this area? What about this area? It's there's definitely no easy answers here. But I think, yeah, looking at children's literature specifically is a really kind of salient area to focus in on.
I think the point is like we have to have the conversation, right? Like I definitely, as much as I love Dr. Seuss, like I recognize like maybe that's not necessarily the book I want to buy for my nephew right now. So I totally get that. And I see that with everything. I think this taboo dinner topics, right? This idea that we can all come to the table and have legitimate conversations, recognizing that all of us have a different perspective and we can all learn something from each other is what has to happen as we think about, trans issues and LGBTQ issues and women's issues. Like we have to be able to have the conversation in safe spaces.
I have to say, we need to take this opportunity to thank Ayana for this topic. This topic was Ayana's brainchild. When I was in a meeting with the graduate studies committee, we were saying, what should the symposium be about? And Ayana was sitting there, she goes, how about taboo dinner topics? And it's all, yeah, exactly. Hearts to you. It's been an amazing topic all day long. Ayana, thank you so much for your creativity in this.
You're very welcome. Thank you all for running with it, because this is exactly I think what we envisioned for sure.
Well, thank you again, everyone. We are out of time, unfortunately, but the discussion doesn't have to stop here. So whenever we come and run into each other tomorrow or at any other point in the future, let's continue this conversation, continue our inquiry into these things. Again, I just wanted to thank all of the speakers for their fantastic work that they've produced. Each and every one of them did an amazing job at presenting their research and their perspective from their respective departments. So, and with that, we all are good to break.
All right, thank you, everybody.